Welcome to Insights. I'm Adam Rivers.
And I'm Sarah Collins. In this episode, we'll reflect carefully on the Quran, verse by verse, focusing on wording, context, and coherence.
It is great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to set the stage for you, let's just quickly recall where we left off last time. Previously, the revelation diagnosed this really profound, hidden condition. It described this disease in the hearts.
Right.
And it's characterized by these dense layers of self-delusion, deeply rooted hypocrisy, and this really dangerous false sense of security. It's essentially a psychological and spiritual sickness that only worsens when it's ignored. It just compounds upon itself, right? Until the afflicted person can't even feel their own numbness anymore.
Yeah, that numbness is the terrifying part.
Yeah.
And now we arrive at the 11th verse of the second chapter, Al-Baqarah. The translation of the verse reads, "And when it is said to them, 'Do not cause corruption on the earth,' they say, 'We are but reformers.'" So when you hear those words, consider this. How do you think a heart suffering from that terminal internal disease reacts when society finally holds up a mirror and demands strict accountability?
That is such a heavy question. And, transitioning into the actual mechanics of this behavior, how exactly does the revelation connect this sudden social confrontation to the invisible internal disease we analyzed in the previous session?
Well, what happens when a high-pressure boiler safety valve is welded completely shut and the heat underneath it is continually turned up?
I mean, eventually it explodes, right?
Exactly. Eventually, the internal pressure violently breaches the exterior. That is the absolute essence of this connection. The Qur'an is not describing an outright philosophical rejection of faith here. It is exposing a concealed inner flaw that has inevitably and aggressively manifested in the social sphere.
Right.
The question posed to you is profound. Is simply telling someone to stop their destructive behavior enough to trigger self-reflection? Or will a sick heart interpret that advice as an existential threat?
Because they can't handle the truth.
Precisely. And we discover the answer in the opening phrasing, "and when." This when, or if, establishes a recurring, highly predictable pattern. It is not a one-time accident. It reveals a stable, unyielding psychological stance. A genuine truth seeker might make a grievous error, experience confusion, and then correct course. But a diseased heart has a fixed, knee-jerk response every single time. Immediate, hostile justification.
That makes so much sense. I was actually recently reviewing a sociological study on toxic organizational leadership, and it perfectly mirrors this. The researchers found that the most destructive leaders aren't the ones who make bad strategic calls.
Oh, absolutely not.
Right. They are the ones who, when confronted with their catastrophic errors, instinctively launch into this rehearsed monologue about how they are the only visionaries keeping the company afloat. The defense is an automatic reflex rather than a genuine evaluation of the data. Does the revelation capture that same automated deflection?
It captures it with absolute linguistic precision. This is where the syntax of the verse becomes incredibly revealing. The verse utilizes the passive voice. It is said to them. Notice the deliberate, striking omission of who is actually speaking.
Oh, wow.
Human nature possesses a fatal flaw where we obsess over personalities. We love to put the messenger on trial to entirely avoid the substance of the message by completely dropping the speaker from the sentence. The revelation shifts the focus away from personal disputes and anchors it entirely on the objective standard of truth.
Wait, so the grammar itself completely erases the identity of the person giving the advice to trap the perpetrator?
Yes, precisely. The grammar strips away any opportunity for them to launch an ad hominem attack against the advisor. It leaves them stranded with nothing but the reality of their own actions. Furthermore, the passive phrase implies the pushback is originating from the outside, from the collective conscience of society or the boundaries of revelation.
Because it's a public issue now.
Exactly. Because the pushback is external, it fundamentally proves that this is no longer a private, isolated sin. The sickness is no longer confined to the individual's chest. It has violently spilled over. The corruption has harmed others to the point that society at large has no choice but to step in and say, enough.
If the community is stepping in because the damage has crossed a critical threshold, what exactly is the nature of this damage? Like, when the revelation commands, "Do not cause corruption on the earth," how wide is the scope of that prohibition?
Well, let me ask you this. If you drop a heavy stone into a tranquil pond, do you only measure the initial splash, or do you have to account for the ripples that eventually crash against the distant shore?
You definitely have to look at the ripples. The whole pond is affected.
Right. The command here requires you to look at the ripples. This isn't about correcting a minor bad habit in your personal routine. Do not cause corruption on the earth. It's a massive, uncompromising red line covering the widest possible arena you can imagine.
It's everything.
Yes. The earth, in this context, isn't merely dirt, agriculture, and geography. It encompasses the entirety of the human ecosystem. Morality, the economy, intricate human relationships, societal security, and the physical environment. You are being warned not to disrupt the delicate, interwoven balance of all human and natural existence.
That is huge. Looking at industrial history, you see monopolies that didn't just extract resources. They intentionally destroyed the soil chemistry of entire regions just to force reliance on their proprietary chemical fertilizers.
Exactly.
They weren't just practicing poor agriculture, they were actively sabotaging the ecosystem for leverage. How deep does this concept of active sabotage go into the linguistic roots of the verse?
To comprehend the true depth, you have to dissect the Arabic root of the word used for corruption, which is fasad.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean doing something generically bad. It literally means taking a system or an entity that is sound, pure, and functional, and intentionally breaking it.
It's
Highly intentional. It is not romanticized, theatrical evil like a villain in a fictional story. It is the cold, calculated mechanics of systemic sabotage. When food is subjected to facade, it doesn't just change state, it becomes actively toxic to the body. When a judicial system is subjected to facade, it transforms from a mechanism of protection into an engine of oppression.
It weaponizes the system.
Exactly, and the specific transitive verb form deployed here dictates that they are actively inflicting this destruction on others.
Hold on, so hypocrisy isn't just a passive state of internal contradiction. It is an active, deployed weapon designed to destroy the absolute center of human society.
It is a violently aggressive deployed weapon. The transitive impact is devastating because it targets the load-bearing pillar of civilization, which is trust. Yes, a society can endure severe economic depressions, and it can rebuild after catastrophic natural disasters, but it cannot survive a total systemic collapse of communal trust. When people actively inflict this kind of systemic sabotage while operating under the guise of righteousness, they sever the very social contract that holds humanity together.
Understanding that society has drawn this massive red line against systemic sabotage, how does the diseased heart react when suddenly confronted with the undeniable reality of their destructive actions?
Have you ever placed your hand on a scorching hot stove?
Unfortunately, yes.
Your arm jerks back before your brain even registers the sensation of pain, right?
Yeah, it's just a pure reflex.
That biological reflex is the exact psychological mechanism at play here. The immediate reply highlighted in the Quran is simply, they say. There is no pause. There's no period of hesitation. There's no contemplative asking, what did we do? How did our actions cause harm?
They just react.
The tongue moves at lightning speed before the conscience can even awaken. It is a desperate, frantic rush to reinforce their psychological fortress because to them, their pristine, carefully curated self-image is infinitely more precious than objective reality.
That sounds identical to modern crisis management. When a major institution is caught in a profound scandal, their public relations firm will issue a polished statement within minutes claiming the institution is actually the victim of a smear campaign.
Every single time.
It is a complete structural refusal to sit with the discomfort of accountability. Why do they respond with such an absolute, unwavering declaration of their own innocence?
The arrogance is embedded in a tiny, highly restrictive word in their response. Only, or but, as in, we are but reformers. This is the ultimate peak of psychological arrogance. It violently slams the door on any potential for self-review.
Because they leave no room for error.
Zero room. They don't offer a nuanced defense like, we try to do good or we mean what. They claim an absolute, flawless, unassailable identity. And there is a brilliant, insidious psychological trick embedded in this response. By claiming to be absolute reformers, they subtly shift the entire battlefield.
Wait. By adopting the absolute title of reformer, they are mathematically forcing the person who advised them into the role of the antagonist.
It is a masterclass in toxic deflection. Think about the narrative geometry here. If I define myself as the embodiment of reform, then by definition, anyone telling me to stop must be an agent of corruption.
Oh, that is so manipulative.
It shifts the conversation violently. It moves from evaluating real-world measurable actions to debating invisible internal intentions. Furthermore, notice the pronoun we. They hide behind a vague collective identity. Using we diffuses individual responsibility and creates a dense fog of false immunity. When you merge into a collective we, you feel emboldened and powerful against individual accountability.
That collective shield of being a reformer is a terrifying defense mechanism. But digging deeper into the language, what is the profound structural danger of claiming that specific title over any other?
What is the difference between a citizen quietly sweeping the sidewalk in front of their house and an individual declaring themselves the supreme, unquestionable architect of the entire city?
One is just helping out, and the other is demanding total authority.
Exactly. There is a massive consequential difference between being a good person and claiming the title of reformer. A good person is privately righteous. They manage their own moral affairs well and do no harm. But a reformer claims a mandate of leadership. They actively step into the public square to fix others. The terrifying reality exposed here is that the architects of corruption are claiming to be the very saviors of the society they are actively dismantling.
The historical parallels are impossible to ignore. Look at colonial powers in the 19th and 20th centuries. They never invaded a country stating their intention was to plunder resources.
No, they always had a noble excuse.
Right. They operated under the banner of a civilizing mission. They adopted the vocabulary of reform and salvation to mask brutal extraction. How does the Qur'an define true reform in contrast to this historical masking?
To grasp the contrast, we must look at the Arabic word for reform used here, which is islah. True islah in the Qur'an is the concrete, measurable restoration of justice and balance. It is returning a broken system to its optimal functional state.
Okay.
Fake reform, on the other hand, often manifests as appeasing an oppressor just to maintain a superficial quiet, which actually entrenches the injustice permanently. The revelation forces you to ask a terrifying question. Are these people lying, or do they actually believe their own propaganda?
I always wonder that.
The diagnosis is that it is both. It begins with intentional, calculated deceit, but it eventually devolves into terminal self-deception.
Wait, the disease eventually rewires their perceptions so thoroughly that they actually hallucinate their systemic deviation as the straight path.
The self-delusion becomes absolute. The heart's disease progresses to a terminal point where severe, destructive deviation looks exactly like righteous progress to them. This is why the revelation establishes a brutal, highly practical standard. If your beautiful, eloquent initiatives cause division, marginalization, and harm, you are corrupting. The standard is action. You don't get a free pass because you meant well in your own twisted internal logic.
If the standard is strictly based on real-world impact rather than internal intentions, how does the systemic corruption mechanically operate? What are the specific axes by which they break down the earth?
Well, how do you completely collapse a towering suspension bridge without ever touching the steel cables?
You go for the foundation. You erode the base.
Exactly. You quietly erode the concrete foundations anchoring it to the earth. Expanding on the phrase, in the earth, we must understand that human stewardship isn't solely about physical architecture. Rebuilding the earth isn't merely about erecting skyscrapers, paving highways, and engineering microchips. It is about establishing justice and nurturing trust. Without those invisible weight-bearing pillars, all material progress is just a shiny, brittle surface laid over a terrifying void.
You see this dynamic heavily in modern algorithmic technology. Platforms boast about connecting the world and driving unprecedented economic progress. But the underlying mechanics often prioritize engagement by shattering communal trust, amplifying outrage, and normalizing misinformation.
Yes, the engagement metrics drive the destruction.
Exactly. They possess the shiny architectural triumph of the software, but the sociological foundation is deeply compromised. What are the specific mechanisms driving this kind of foundational erosion?
The mechanics of this systemic sabotage operate relentlessly on three main axes. First, hitting the truth. This means normalizing lies, financial fraud, and strategic misinformation until objective reality itself becomes a blurred, subjective debate.
So gaslighting on a societal level.
Exactly. Second, hitting people. This involves shattering communal trust, turning neighbors into suspicious adversaries, and monetizing division. Third, hitting nature. This is the reckless exploitation of the physical environment, depleting shared resources under the highly deceptive guise of necessary development. These three axes work in tandem to dismantle the earth. Notice also the plural form used in the verse.
Does the plural form explicitly dictate that this level of societal sabotage requires an organized, complicit network to function?
It strictly requires an ecosystem of complicity. Hypocrites operate in synchronized groups, exchanging social and financial benefits until corruption transitions from an individual moral failing into the invisible, omnipresent cultural atmosphere. This is exactly why the Quran deliberately leaves the specific crimes completely unlisted in this verse.
Oh, it doesn't list them.
It doesn't provide an itemized list saying do not steal, do not hoard wealth, or do not pollute. Why? Because systemic corruption is inherently shape-shifting. If the revelation provided a rigid, static checklist of crimes, the corrupt would simply hire lawyers to find technical loopholes, proudly declaring, "We didn't do that specific thing." Keeping the command incredibly broad traps their shape-shifting nature perfectly.
If their methods are constantly shape-shifting to avoid these technical definitions, how do they manage to maintain public support? Like, how do they keep society convinced that they are actually the good guys while engaging in this massive network of sabotage?
Let me put it this way. If you decide you want to steal a massive estate, do you risk picking the lock in the dead of night, or do you simply bribe an official to forge a new deed with your name legally printed on it?
You change the paperwork, it's much safer.
The ultimate power in any society doesn't belong to the one who breaks the laws. It belongs to the one who writes the dictionary. The corrupt hijack language itself. They weaponize the broad, noble title of reformer to shut down analytical dialogue entirely. They use their stated intention as an impenetrable shield of immunity. When a leader responds to a highly specific, data-driven critique with a generalized emotional appeal to a noble title, you are witnessing a massive, flashing red flag.
That is the exact anatomy of political euphemism. When a corporation executes mass layoffs to boost executive bonuses, they don't call it greed. They call it synergy optimizations or strategic restructuring.
Yes, the sanitization of harm.
Right. They aren't answering the critique of the harm caused. They are using a heavy sanitized phrase to crush the inquiry. How does this linguistic manipulation connect back to the disease of hypocrisy?
Hypocrites thrive on introducing chronic, systemic instability. You never know who to trust or what is real because the language being spoken no longer matches the reality being experienced. When safety shakes, justice inevitably falls apart, and the public sphere is decimated. We often think of corruption as physical theft, but the cruelest, most destructive form of corruption is the intentional sabotage of meaning. When reform is utilized as a cheap marketing slogan for every selfish, destructive agenda, the word is violently emptied of all its weight.
Wait, are you saying the ultimate victim of this specific type of corruption is the concept of meaning itself?
Meaning itself is assassinated. True reform dies not from a lack of genuine effort by good people, but from the overwhelming, suffocating abundance of fake claims. This represents the ultimate historical struggle over naming. Tyrants will always label their brutal oppression as stability, and thieves will endlessly defend their theft as a historical right.
It's all about framing.
And the revelation intervenes directly in this linguistic war by stripping the perpetrator of the authority to define their own actions. You do not get to be the judge, the jury, and the dictionary for your own behavior. True reform must firmly align with a higher, objective standard of honesty, mercy, and justice, not personal opinion or political convenience. Swapping names, audaciously calling a fatal sickness perfect health, is the ultimate terminal symptom of a diseased heart.
That clash over who possesses the authority to define reality is incredibly intense. Moving forward, how does the structure of the verse highlight this eternal historical battle between empty words and destructive reality?
Think about what happens when you aim a high-powered stadium spotlight at a flimsy shadow puppet.
The illusion is gone. You just see the hands making the shape.
Exactly. The illusion instantly vanishes, and you are left with the stark reality of the mechanics. The Qur'an forces this exact exposure through the direct, jarring contrast between it is said and they say. This is a profound structural clash. Think about the logical contradiction. If these individuals were truly reformers, society wouldn't need to desperately beg them to stop corrupting. Genuine reformers are the ones who need community help building things. They don't need to be universally commanded to stop inflicting harm on everyone around them.
It really evokes the image of someone standing in a glass house, violently swinging a sledgehammer, claiming they are simply redecorating, while everyone else in the building is screaming at them to stop.
That's the perfect visual.
The undeniable physical reality of their action completely and absurdly contradicts their self-appointed title. How do they cognitively escape the glaring obviousness of this contradiction?
They escape by utilizing the word reform to teleport straight past the debate and arrive at a forced conclusion. They terminate the discussion before any learning, reflection, or accountability can take root. Pay close attention to the grammatical shift engineered here. Do not corrupt is a present tense verb. A verb describes a fluid, changeable behavior, but reformers is a noun. A noun describes a fixed, foundational identity.
Wait, so this grammatical pivot from a verb to a noun isn't just a psychological quirk. It is literally the blueprint of how historical elite power preserves itself against critique.
It is the oldest and most effective survival trick in the architecture of power. Throughout all of recorded history, elite structures that fear losing their unearned privilege will invariably adopt the language of the truth they are suppressing. They loudly claim to reform the system while actually executing maneuvers to secure their own dominance. The standard of true reform, Islah, means returning a thing to its proper healthy state for the benefit of all. But if your internal standard is your own self-interest, or pleasing a specific crowds rather than establishing universal justice, your reform is entirely fake. Hearing the command "do not corrupt," placed immediately adjacent to the claim "we are reformers," creates intense, deliberate cognitive dissonance for the listener. The Qur'an forces you to stare directly at this glaring contradiction so you are never fooled by it again.
If the mask is manufactured to be that convincing and the language is that deeply corrupted by those in power, how are we supposed to identify true reform? What is the practical litmus test to separate the architects of healing from the architects of destruction?
How do metallurgists definitively tell the difference between fool's gold and authentic gold? They apply intense heat and observe the chemical reaction. The revelation exposes this twisted defensive logic specifically to protect you from despairing. It serves as a stark warning not to let bad actors permanently hijack the vocabulary of goodness. The ultimate, unshakable litmus test to spot a true reformer is observing their immediate reaction to criticism.
The reaction is everything.
Exactly. A true reformer, when told they are making a mistake that causes harm, pauses, lowers their defenses, and asks, "Where is the flaw? Help me see it so I can fix it." A fake reformer instantly cowers behind the fortress of their title.
You see this clearly in fields that require rigorous peer review, like medicine or engineering. If a surgeon or an engineer refuses to let their work be critically examined by others, they are stripped of their license because that arrogance is lethal.
It's a matter of life and death in those fields.
Yet, in the broader social and political sphere, individuals who exhibit that exact same refusal to be critiqued are often elected or celebrated as strong leaders. Does this refusal mean they have permanently lost the capacity to grow?
It means they've permanently slammed the door in confession. And this is a vital, profound educational point embedded in the verse. We must rigorously raise ourselves to possess the psychological strength to confess our mistakes. Saying, "we are but reformers," makes actual, tangible growth mathematically impossible because you cannot cure a disease you stubbornly refuse to acknowledge. Yet the presence of the phrase, "it is said to them," proves that society, the community, or the truth itself is still actively trying to reach them and advise them.
Wait, the specific phrasing, "it is said to them," proves that the mechanism of mercy is still actively pursuing them, even while they're swinging the sledgehammer.
It proves the door of mercy remains wide open. The external world has not yet given up on them. The critical failure is not a lack of reminders from the outside. It is a total, catastrophic lack of reception due to their internal disease. But because hidden corruption is so deceptive, it requires a grounded, objective standard to be identified and cured. You cannot evaluate these actors by their beautiful, sweeping speeches or their pristine, self-appointed titles. You must brutally evaluate the tangible results. You have to look at the real-world impact. Does this specific initiative, this specific action, leave the earth broken, or does it leave it whole?
That brings us to the fundamental root of the issue. If they claim to be reformers, why doesn't the verse just instruct them, reform yourselves? Why is there a specific negative command to stop corrupting before any mention of reform?
Would you politely ask a surgical team to begin a delicate operation while the hospital operating room is actively engulfed in flames?
No, you have to put out the fire first.
You would not. The reason the revelation doesn't simply say reform yourselves is because stopping the act of harm is the absolute, non-negotiable prerequisite to building anything of value. You have to extinguish the fire and stop the bleeding first. You cannot build a magnificent house while simultaneously taking a jackhammer to the foundation. But these individuals use language as an impenetrable veil. It is a terrifying sociological phenomenon where words originally designed to eliminate the truth are weaponized to completely obscure it. When the vocabulary spoken does not align with the actions taken, the bridge of trust collapses.
It perfectly aligns with the psychological concept of moral licensing. People will do one highly visible good thing or claim a good title and then subconsciously use that as a license to commit terrible acts behind the scenes, believing their title balances the cosmic scale. Why do humans consistently choose this massive, destructive disconnect between their stated values and their hidden actions?
It almost universally stems from two raw primal impulses, greed and fear.
Greed and fear.
The paralyzing fear of losing their elevated social status, or the insatiable greed for unearned praise and power. They desperately crave the glory, the societal respect, and the authority that comes with a reformer title. But they absolutely refuse to pay the painful, humbling price of true reform, which demands deep humility, transparency, and personal sacrifice. So instead of doing the work, they weaponize their identity. They turn a noble, universal value into a closed, exclusionary identity to use as a tool for emotional blackmail.
So they essentially take the concept of goodness hostage to protect themselves from accountability.
It is pure defensive blackmail. If you dare to criticize their specific harmful actions, they immediately spin the narrative to accuse you of attacking the very concept of reform itself. But the counter-standard established here is radically clear. You cannot fix the broken world with a sick heart. True reform must start entirely inward. It begins by rigorously curing oneself of the love of control, the desperate desire for dominance, and the subtle addiction to deception. If the internal core is rotten, every external attempt at reform will eventually just systematize and spread the rot.
So all of these complex mechanics, the linguistic hijacking, the transitive sabotage, the defensive reflexes, they all converge at a singular, terrifying point about human self-awareness. What happens to the psyche when the disease, the corruption, and the lies fully and permanently fuse together?
What happens when an actor plays a role for so many years that they literally forget their own given name and believe they are the character?
They lose themselves completely.
This is where every element we've discussed converges. The disease, the systemic corruption, and the habitual lies meet at the absolute, terrifying inability to view oneself honestly. The mask is permanently welded to the face, the flesh is grown around it. And the logic we are analyzing here isn't just an ancient parable. It repeats everywhere in human behavior, scaling from the dinner table to the global stage.
You see this tragically in abusive interpersonal dynamics. It's the controlling partner or the toxic micromanager who genuinely, in their own mind, believes their suffocating control is an act of deep care and protection.
Yes.
Or the person who spreads malicious, community-destroying gossip yet looks in the mirror and sees a heroic whistleblower warning people. They literally lack the cognitive architecture to see the craters they are leaving behind.
That is the perfect chilling application of this verse in daily life. The tragedy is that they don't just act outside the boundaries of a value. They audaciously claim to be the physical embodiment of the value itself. This makes curing them incredibly, almost impossibly difficult. The internal disease fiercely fights the medicine by actively pretending to be the medicine. If you approach them offering a cure for their systemic destruction, they look at you with genuine bewilderment and tell you that they are already the chief surgeon.
When the disease perfectly disguises itself as the cure, the situation seems almost hopeless. So, as observers trying to navigate this, is the refusal to be transparent the final, undeniable proof that the reform is actually a scam?
Yes. The counter-standard provided by the revelation is unshakable and universally applicable. Any so-called reform that violently rejects transparency, aggressively avoids objective criticism, or deliberately divides people into hostile, suspicious factions is an absolute fraud. If your proposed reform cannot survive the harsh light of day, if it crumbles when subjected to an honest, data-driven question, it is not reform. It is systemic corruption. The true health of a heart and the authentic truth of any movement is unequivocally revealed in the exact microsecond moment it receives criticism. If it instantly builds a towering fortress of excuses and attacks the questioner, it is deathly sick. If it lowers its defenses and opens the door to reflection, it is alive.
Thank you for that incredibly thorough and illuminating explanation. To synthesize the complex dynamics we've uncovered in this episode, true reform is always measured by its tangible, real-world impact, not by the eloquence of its stated intentions. When an identity or a noble title is hijacked and weaponized as a shield against accountability, systemic corruption spreads rapidly, dissolving the foundational trust of society. And ultimately, the true health of a human heart is instantly revealed in the exact moment it is confronted with criticism. I want to leave you with a profound, open-ended question to ponder as you navigate your own life. When your own actions are questioned or critiqued by those around you, does your heart immediately begin constructing a heavily armed fortress of good intentions to hide behind? Or do you possess the rare, transformative courage to let the walls down, look at the damage, and ask, could I actually be the one breaking things? Thank you for listening to Insights. That's it for this episode of Insights. If you found this reflection helpful, follow the show and join us next time as we continue verse by verse in the Qur'an. Until then, take one idea from this verse into your day.